Experiment 876, Mutual Lucid Dreaming. As Pinnacle became more and more solidified as an expert in the field of research for human betterment, other organizations were taking notice. One of these groups was the United States military. Word had quickly spread about the work that Pinnacle had produced and the level of expertise that could be expected from their staff. Naturally, this trickled out from person to person across both medical and non-medical communities, eventually finding its way to the desk of a rather high-ranking military official in the U.S. Army. Much of it was just rumors, twisted a bit as they passed from person to person, but they felt that there was enough credibility in them to at least approach Pinnacle. After a few quick phone calls between the Pinnacle staff and various government officials, the military officers were granted the clearance they needed to get an inside look at Pinnacle's research. The team was to be headed up by General William Howard and several military medical personnel with backgrounds ranging from human genetics and physiology out to more eclectic topics. There were only 4 members of the team, including the general, purposefully kept small so as not to draw too much attention to their actions. Upon arrival, they were greeted in the lobby by a Pinnacle researcher that only introduced himself as Dr. Allen. After a quick round of handshakes, the military personnel were provided with special red badges with the word "Secure" printed in large black letters across the bottom. They were told that they would grant them access to most portions of the facility, save one basement 3 stories under their feet. The general narrowed his eyes, looking briefly around the lobby. He opened his mouth to ask the obvious question about the basement's contents, but was cut short by Dr. Allen turning on a heel and striding swiftly towards the main entry point to the rest of the building. The group followed him through the security checkpoint, each scanning their card in turn. The group turned and walked down a plain hallway that could belong in any office building in the world. They passed doors about every 10 feet or so, but none of them were labeled, and each one looked exactly the same as all the others. After about a 5-minute walk straight down that hallway, Allen approached a door near the end on the right. He scanned his badge, and a series of loud clicks and clacks could be heard from the other side of the door. The door opened on its own, and Allen ushered the group in, motioning to a large seating area opposite the desk near the center of the room. The room lacked any windows, the only light coming from the inset lights above. The general's mind wandered, thinking about the large glass windows on the outside of the building. They must be close to the outside of the building, right? They hadn't gone down any stairs, so he knew they were still above ground. He was jolted out of his thoughts when one of his team elbowed him in the side. Dr. Allen had been speaking directly to him, asking the general how Pinnacle could help solve whatever problem it was that brought them there. The general shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, and regained his authoritative composure. "We've encountered some issues with the efficiency of some of our newer squads," he began. "They've worked hard in boot camp to hone their skills, but they still lack the cohesiveness that comes from an effective team working together on a mission. We need them in top form to locate a target that's been elusive to our troops." Dr. Allen nodded along, writing short notes as the general continued. "We understand that one of the things your group does is work with the minds of your subjects and try to help them be better at things." Allen smiled. "Yes, we do help with things like that." His pen returned to the pad in front of him, scratching out a few more lines. When he looked back up at the general, the smile faded from his face. He took a more serious tone. "I think we can help you, General," he began. "Are you familiar with the concept of lucid dreaming?" The general shook his head, but one of the members of his team coughed and raised his hand timidly. Allen nodded to him. "It's a state where the subject dreams, but they know they're dreaming and are able to control some parts of the dream." The smile returned to Allen's face. "Very good, Dr. Edwards." Edwards looked away, surprised that Dr. Allen knew his name. "Now, Dr. Allen continued. We've been working on a way to use hypnosis to plant an idea in a subject's head, and upon hearing a keyword while asleep, that idea would be triggered. Initially, we just used it to see if we could help individuals overcome fears that were impacting their quality of life. We used this approach to coerce the subject's mind into forcing them to confront their greatest fear head-on. The goal was to give them a situation with no way out except to move past the fear and conquer it, except that we didn't equip them with any skills that would help them make that breakthrough. Instead, we added a second keyword that would trigger a follow-up suggestion that let them know they were dreaming. Subjects later reported that they felt empowered and could alter the dream in such a way that they could attack the fear head-on and destroy it. He continued, "We ended up with an 85% success rate from that initial round of the experiment. There were some unfortunate circumstances with some of the subjects, but overall, the experiment was deemed a success." The general had nodded along as Dr. Allen talked, the ideas swimming in his head about how they could apply this approach. He cleared his throat, and without any consultation with his team of experts, smiled and said, "That sounds perfect." The next week, a team of lower-ranked military personnel in full fatigues arrived at the Pinnacle offices. They were greeted in the lobby by Dr. Allen, smiling and shaking each one of their hands and introducing himself. He presented each of them with blue keycards and motioned for them to follow him, again requesting that each scan as they passed through the gates. "We do all of our testing in-house at this facility," he explained. "We have all the experts we need under this roof, so there's not really a reason to go anywhere else." The group nodded as they followed him through the silent halls. They continued walking for another 10 minutes, not encountering another person, either passing in the hallway or entering and leaving one of the many rooms. After a few more minutes and several more turns, Dr. Allen stopped outside of a door that looked just like all the others. He placed his keycard on the reader, it beeped happily, and the light turned green. A series of clicks and clacks could be heard from the other side of the door, and once they stopped, it opened inward. Dr. Allen ushered the group into the large room, blindingly lit from above and containing 5 hospital beds, one for each of them. Several large pieces of medical equipment were also scattered around the space. "If each of you would please take a seat on one of the beds and remove your shoes, we can get started," Dr. Allen instructed. The team glanced at each other, confused by the lack of context, but followed orders as the general had instructed them to do. Other Pinnacle staff entered the room and began hooking each soldier to the equipment beside their bed. They were each given a mild sedative to relax them, and were told that they would be taken, one at a time, to a room next door to have the mental portion of the procedure completed. Over the next hour, each soldier was taken out of the room and returned, looking no different. When the last soldier returned to his bed, Dr. Allen nodded to his staff. They busied themselves with the large machines, typing commands into attached keyboards and pausing occasionally. Soon the room was filled with the hum of these machines. Each researcher then placed a mesh over the head of each soldier, connecting it to the machine by a long cable. Dr. Allen stood in the center of the room and addressed them. "Now, if you will all give me your attention, we can begin." He flipped through a folder in his hand to locate the page he needed. "The general has informed me that you have an upcoming mission, a seek and destroy type, where you would be hunting down a foreign agent responsible for the deaths of hundreds. He has instructed each of you with your tasks for the mission in detail, so you understand your role thoroughly." They nodded silently, and he continued. "These machines," he pointed around the room, "are designed to monitor your brain activity while you sleep, allowing us to keep track of the progress that you're making. During your hypnosis session, you were each implanted with a trigger word that, while you're dreaming, will let you understand that you're in a dream and be able to control it via lucid dreaming. At this point, a second trigger word will be spoken, the same for all of you, and your dream will shift to the beginning of your mission. You will all follow orders and complete the mission as described by verbal cues from us on the outside. The goal is to complete the mission despite any obstacles we may throw your way." The soldiers nodded and laid back, trying to relax and let the sedative take hold. Soon they were all asleep, the constant hum of the machines only occasionally broken up by the loud snores from certain members of the group. Alan nodded to his staff. He stood in the center of the room and loudly and clearly said the first trigger word: "Stealth." Monitors around the room began beeping as the brain activity of each soldier changed in response. Alan made a note in his records and then went around the room, verifying that each subject was stable enough to continue. Satisfied, he moved on to the second stage. Once again, he stood in the center of the room and, loudly and clearly, said the second trigger word: "Execute." The monitoring equipment once again registered the change in brain activity, beeping loudly, but soon settling back into a normal rhythm. Dr. Allen looked around the room at his researchers. "Well, let's begin." The soldiers returned every night for the next few weeks, each going through the same process. While most were able to complete the mission before they awoke each morning, one was still having trouble. He was restless and would sometimes talk in his sleep, repeating the same phrase over and over: "Please God, no, please no," sometimes for up to an hour at a time. When he woke in the morning, he didn't remember anything out of the ordinary, just that he had come up against some obstacle, a different one each night that prevented him from finishing the mission. Dr. Allen reported this back to the general, expressing concern not only for the soldier's ability to complete the mission, but also for his mental state. As the weeks progressed, he began to look more and more gaunt. Dark circles had developed under his eyes, and his skin had become more pale. All of his vitals remained normal, however, so the general ordered that he continue the experiment. The soldier's health continued to deteriorate. Somewhere along the way, he started mumbling to himself in a garbled form of English. The words were right, but they were in the wrong order. He also continued to talk in his sleep, his protests getting louder each night. More than once, the researchers had to increase the dosage of the sedative they'd given him to keep him under control. Despite pleas from Allen, the general insisted that the soldier continue in the program. The day came, and the experiment concluded. The general arrived at the Pinnacle offices and debriefed each soldier one by one, assessing their readiness for the mission. The time came, and Allen ushered in the last soldier into the room with the general. He was frail and shuffled more than walked in. He looked everywhere but at the general, mumbling quietly in some language neither of them understood. "General, as you can clearly see, this soldier is unfit for duty. I tried to tell you multiple times that—" The general cut him off with a glare. Allen nodded and backed out of the room, closing the door behind him. It clicked and clacked as the locks automatically engaged. The soldier went silent and stared at the floor. After several minutes, the general broke the silence, clearing his throat. The soldier remained completely silent, not even shifting in his chair. The general rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building. "Now, listen to me, soldier. We've invested a lot of time and the government's money in putting you in this program," the general said firmly. "We're not about to just let that go to waste because—" He stopped in mid-sentence. His headache was getting worse, much worse, and quickly. Sharp pains had started on the right side of his head, and he started to feel pressure building behind his right eye. He tried to continue, but the words caught in his throat as the sharp pains grew even stronger. His stomach turned, and he quickly grabbed a wastebasket to keep what was left of his lunch from splashing all over the hard linoleum floor beside him. The general sat back up in his chair, and flashes of light danced in front of his eyes, partially blocking his vision. He swayed back and forth in his chair, and the room spun around him. The pain was almost too much, and the pressure behind his eye threatened to push it right from the socket. He clawed at the desk in front of him, trying desperately to remain upright, pleading with the soldier to go get help. But he only sat and watched. The general collapsed to the floor, but he just still watched. He stood and moved to the side of the desk, staring down at the general, who was now writhing in pain, pleading for any kind of help. The soldier cocked his head to one side and began mumbling to himself, again in the same garbled English. His eyes moved to the desktop, coming to rest on a large silver letter opener. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands, feeling its weight. He ran a finger over the sharper side of the blade and gently pressed the tip into his own palm. He approached the general, still in agony on the hard floor of the small office, watching the light glint off the blade of the letter opener. He began to repeat the same phrase over and over as he inched the blade closer and closer to the general's face. "Help me. I have seen you. I can't stop from my dreams." Over and over, and each time he did, his smile grew larger and larger, making him look more and more deranged. As the soldier moved closer, the light glinted from the blade, and the general, instinctively knowing what it was, began pleading for his life. "Please, God, no, please, no." He sobbed, too overcome with pain to do much else. He repeated, "Please, God, no." He said, "Please, no." The soldier went quiet, and the smile left his face. He paused only a moment before hurling himself at the general. Pinning him to the floor, the soldier leaned in close to the general's ear and whispered, "You'll never find me." The general's eyes went wide. The soldier smiled again, leaned back, and plunged the letter opener first into the general's right eye, and then into the left, and finally drove it directly through the center of his forehead, leaving it there. The general went limp, and the soldier rose, standing over his lifeless body, and smiled. He took the handgun from the general's holster. He slowly walked back around the desk, turning the gun over and over in his hand. He sat back down in the same chair across from where the general had sat only minutes before. He held the gun up, admiring its gleam in the harsh overhead lighting. They thought they were so smart, he thought, smirking. He remembered his own bed in the remote facility. He remembered being hooked to the machines. He remembered dreaming each night for the past few weeks, dreaming about those men in uniform, hunting him down and killing him over and over. He'd learned their patterns. He'd learned how to avoid them, and, in one impulsive movement, how to get inside. And there he sat, a mind that did not match the body. The other members of the military team began banging loudly from the other side of the door. He could hear them frantically trying their keycards, trying to get the locks of the door to disengage. He knew it was only a matter of time before the security team would arrive. He'd done what he came to do, though. He calmly placed the end of the gun in his mouth, the hard metallic corners of the blunt barrel stabbing painfully into the roof of his mouth. He heard the locks behind him begin to open, clicking and clacking as they disengaged. The final lock finished with a heavy thud, and the door burst open. He pulled the trigger and slumped lifelessly to the floor.